evening, everyone. Let me just do a few introductory points here. It's indeed a very distinct honor to be present here in this audience. We were talking about this as I entered. I left Margao 31 years ago, so it's a little emotional moment. And progressively, fate and adventures took me further and further away from Margao. So it's a real honor to be here, giving this Dattatreya Hemadi lecture. I'd like to thank Gomant Vidya Niketan, first of all, to give me this honor for this invitation to speak about a topic that I'm dearly passionate about, that has become a part of my life. And I hope I can actually make it interesting for you to understand what is the world of strategy about. Despite the fact that my area of expertise largely resides in oil and gas strategy, something that's really reviled these days, I will take a step back and actually talk a little bit more about what is the art of strategy and what does it mean to us and how we can make it meaningful. Being a son of the soil, as I've been introduced, it is actually very humbling to be present in front of all the luminaries that I grew up with, who are the patrons of this town, who led this town to where it is today. So it is an incredibly humbling moment for me to be in the presence of all of you. I just want to make one point, and I mentioned this to my mother the other day when it became evident. I distinctly remember Mr. Hemadi. Our family used to have a rice and flour mill, and Mr. Hemadi used to live across the street. And he used to walk his dog. And I think when we used to go, and I used to go with my father in the mornings there, I remember him distinct as a very distinguished gentleman walking his dog. I think the name was Yogi, my mother reminded me at that point of time. So it's indeed an honor to be presenting this lecture as well. So the memory is as fresh as it was from 40 years ago of Mr. Hemadi. As has been introduced, I am a product of this town. I did my school here, two schools, Manovikas and Loyola High School, two very distinguished institutions of this town. Further on, I moved to Dhempe College in Panjim, did my 11th and 12th there. At that point of time, it was considered a very hallowed institution as well. I don't know today. Further on, I went and I did my engineering at NIT Karnataka in chemical engineering. Life and its adventures took me further and further out. I went to the US, did my PhD in chemical engineering and petroleum refining, went on to do two postdoctorates, one in the US and one in Europe. Had what I would consider a very fulfilling academic career for over 9 years. And then decided I want to take a different chance in life. Went back to school, did an MBA, and I'm in my current position that it is. I only state this not to tell you what I have done in life. I state this because I want to tie this back into what strategy means. There is no more the world of comfort that we have of following linear trajectories. There is no more the comfort that we can choose a path and stick with it for the rest of our lives. Adaptiveness and our ability to adapt is becoming more and more fundamental to the world of strategy. And hence this ability to be able to move from a student to a researcher to a professor, to back to being a student, to back to being what I would consider today a strategist. I don't know if that word's a good one. And who knows in the future if it's back to a student and back to a professor and whatever else. But a core of what I want to talk about is exactly that, is a life trajectory and a strategic path of whether it is a corporation or an entity, no more is static. It is incredibly dynamic, and adaptiveness and our ability to adapt, as nature always taught us, organisms always were able to adapt much better, is a core of what we should be thinking about as strategy going forward. I have very good and fond memories of Gomant Vidya Niketan actually, and I really want to state this. It was about when I was 7 years old, so it was about 38 years ago, that I think I made my debut, if I were to say, on the stage at Gomant Vidya Niketan in a small dance with 3 other Panandikars actually. It was Sai Panandikar, it was Satyesh Panandikar, and my 2 cousins Rohan and Rohit, who we had literally a 3-minute dance on the stage downstairs. So I really distinctly remember that moment. Post that, I actually had another small session where, as a part of Loyola High School, we had a play by Agatha Christie called A Murder is Announced. And I had a small role again there to play. And that was about 32 years ago. So since then, this is my next and probably the hardest performance that I have. It's easier to read someone else's script and read out and just say it on stage. I think it's a little harder now, where I have to reflect on what I really do and how it can be meaningful to a set of people. So this is going to be my hard act, but I'll try to make sure that I know it stands in line with those, what I would consider very memorable moments. Let me give you a personal view and why I think Salil, when he invited me to give this lecture, I think made a mistake. The art of strategy is all very good, but maybe I have something in my own personal life that I can share that actually makes me completely inadequate to talk about the art of strategy. So it's very easy for us to give advice, as everyone says, and Woody Allen had a very classic line that says, people who do, people who don't teach, and people who can't teach give advice. And so it's so easy for me to actually stand up and actually tell everyone what they should be doing. And so do we really apply this to ourselves? So I'll actually turn the clock back to 1992. It was very normal at that point of time, and it may have happened with many people or your children. When I finished my engineering, I went to the United States to pursue a master's. And somewhere into the master's, the goal was only to do a master's. Somewhere into the master's, I had a friend of mine who had gone from my same college to the United States as well. And he joined this company at that point of time called Microsoft. 1992, I must point out to you, is the year, for some of you are very young, the year after India opened up its doors and made it a very liberal economy. A lot of people consider it the second independence, whatever you want to call it. 1992 was also 3 years after the World Wide Web was born, for most of you who take it for granted today. Not the internet, the World Wide Web, the web pages and all that sort of interface. And 1990 was the year in which the programming language for the World Wide Web was born, which is the HTML, the hypertext markup language. Being the classic nerd and geek who liked programming, I actually, when I got to the US, taught myself HTML. We were all very studious people, and it didn't seem very difficult. So in 6 months, I thought I had reasonably mastered the language. So when I got this call from my friend, I said, he said, Microsoft were looking to hire more people. And if you knew how to program at that point of time, you were a sure hire. And at that point of time, the pay and the stock options and everything was absolutely fantastic. So there I put on my strategic cap and I said, let me think about this opportunity. And it was very simple. I said, it was too easy for me to learn. I'm not sure anyone's going to pay for it. I cannot imagine anyone wanting to pay for something I could teach myself in 6 months. And I said, Microsoft's going to go bankrupt thinking about this as well. They're not going to be able to sell a single thing based on this. This was the era in which Microsoft's high-end package was the Windows 3.1. And so I put my strategic cap on and I said, this is the decision. If I take this job, if I take this choice, I am going to be out of a job in less than a year. So I'm not going to take it. The rest, as they say, is history. Here I am giving you a lecture on how to advise people on strategy. And my friend who joined Microsoft retired about 10 years back, cashing in his stock options. So, so I'm not sure, Salil did the right thing, in inviting me to give the strategy. Having said that, it's been about 10 years in which I've now dedicated my life working with different companies on what should their strategy be and what can we do with regards to their strategy. And I'll make this as a humble attempt, more as a conversation with you, as to what we really mean by strategy. The corporate world has been a pioneer in actually taking strategy. There's only one other part of sectors, if I were to call it, that are actually pioneering as well, which is actually the industry of war. And these two industries have actually really thought through the elements of strategy. So if my examples veer a little bit more towards companies and battles and war, it's by design, it's deliberate, because that's where a lot of the principles and the high thinking on strategy has been devised. But this is not to say it's not applicable to other areas. It is absolutely applicable to every aspect of life. I personally like to think it can be applicable to us as individuals as well, as we start thinking about choices, as we start thinking about options with certain objectives. I'd like to break this up into 3 parts. The first is I want to convince you that strategy is relevant, that strategy is important, and it is more important than ever before. There's been lots written about this world of strategy, saying it's no more important, startups this, startups that. There's all kinds of media, there's a lot of attention given to it, saying that this is completely irrelevant. I want to make a point to you that this is actually critically important. And while we do it, let's create a common vocabulary, and I really insist on this, and this is the one part of the talk, if it's okay with you, I'll get a little technical. Because it's a much used and misused word, strategy. And so if I can do one thing in this audience is let's create a common vocabulary of what do we mean by strategy and how can we actually apply it. And the last part, if you permit me, I'll talk about where the world of strategy is going and where it's headed. And I'll end with a little thinking from my side, more as a question than an answer, of where I think the most disruptive element of strategy is yet to come. So why is strategy important to us? If you take the very famous classic by Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, there's a very interesting exchange between Alice and the Cheshire Cat. And the exchange goes as such. Alice looks up to the cat and asks, "Would you please tell me which way I ought to go from here?" The cat replies, "That depends a good deal on where you want to go." "I don't much care where," said Alice. The cat replies, "Then it doesn't really matter which way you go." If we don't have a direction, if we don't know where you want to go, it really doesn't matter which way you go. So selecting a direction, having a very clear view and perspective of where the goalpost is and where we want to head is absolutely fundamental. You can never get there if you don't know where there is. And if you don't care where there is, then you can go anywhere. It really doesn't matter. So fundamental to making choices about what direction to take is actually knowing where we want to go. Setting direction and choices associated with direction can only become meaningful if we know what the objective that we are trying to achieve is. So let me illustrate to you through two examples of what strategies, and please amuse me for a second here. And I know the spotlight's here, but I can still see you. Everyone who has an Apple smartphone, put up your hand. Everyone who has an Android smartphone, put up your hand. So the HTC, Samsung, all that. Everyone who has a smartphone, put up your hand. Now everyone who has a Nokia, put up your hand. Good. I rest my case. In 2007, Nokia was the global unquestioned leader in the smartphone market. 60% of the market, so 6 out of the 10 people sitting in this room would have actually put up their hand saying, "I have a Nokia phone." And Apple and Samsung being a very distant second, and Apple was a completely non-existent entity. It is exactly this week, 10 years back, 9th of January 2007, when Apple launched its first iPhone. And they had a very different perspective on what the market wanted. They didn't believe that the market wanted another phone. They believed that the market wanted an ecosystem that solved a certain set of problems for a certain market. And Nokia completely chose to misread that direction. Nokia chose to stick with its old-fashioned, they said, well, we own 60% of the market, why should we change? They had an operating system called a Symbian. And for the longest time, Nokia decided, we will not change. This is what we are going to continue doing. In 3 years' time, in a short 3-year span, Nokia's market share had dropped down to half. And by the third quarter of 2012, Nokia's market share was down to single digits, low single digits. As you all know, that story ends very badly. After changing their CEO 4 times, they eventually decided to sell it to Microsoft. Microsoft, as would have been done, was probably dead on arrival, but they still tried to revive it a couple of times and have finally completely shelved the plans associated with doing anything with Nokia. This is a clear example where There was a trend. The trend was clear. There was a demand in the market. The consumers and the customers were asking for a specific thing. Nokia, deliberately or not, chose to ignore that. They chose a strategy that took them on a path. They made a deliberate choice to go on that strategy that took them on a path. They did not allocate any resources to responding to the market the way they should have. And the rest, as we say, is history. Nokia is no more. The second example I want to give is a little bit closer to home. And I know everyone talks about this. But this has got to do with the area of economic development and why strategy is relevant even to the area of economic development. Two geographic entities, and I leave it as geographic entities, Singapore and Goa. Singapore as a nation state was born in 1959. Goa as a geographical entity that we know today was born in 1961. Just for the record, the GDP per capita of Goa in 1961 was higher than that of Singapore in 1961. They're actually quite comparable when we start out. In fact, I would say Singapore was at a disadvantage because it's a marshy land. Anyone who knows Singapore from back then and has checked up the history realizes this was a marshy land. They have no natural resources. They don't even have clean water. They set themselves on a clear path, a clear strategy, a clear direction, followed that up with economic, social, cultural, every aspect of that strategy. Today, the GDP per capita of Singapore is at about 55 to 60,000 US dollars. Goa stands at about 5,000 US dollars. Completely divergent paths. Mind you, I have no intention throughout this talk to make any comments on ideology or how you get there. This is just about saying they've got the right set of things, the right direction to be moving forward. I hope I've actually put, at least in your mind, a little bit of the seeds as to why I think strategy is important. Whether we compare ourselves as states, economic entities, corporations, and you can extend this beyond that to ourselves, to many other things of our lives. But before we go any further, let's talk a little bit about what strategy is, and more fundamentally, what strategy is not. I personally feel that it's one of those words that's very loosely used. And I actually did do this exercise this morning of going to the newspapers. Newspapers today is just the media and Google. And actually ran up the word strategy to see what would turn up and got into the news section of it rather than the general section. And I'll read out to you the completely disparate things that I heard or read with regards to strategy. So I don't know why, but I'll read them to you so you can get an idea of how the word strategy is being used. Road safety strategy. Trump's strategy for competitiveness. Strategy for garbage disposal. Debt fund accrual strategy. The Brexit strategy. Talent strategy. Retention strategy. Exit strategy. Career strategy. China strategy. Bowling strategy. Batting strategy. I think this appears in the newspapers every day. Luckily, at this time of the year here in Goa, election poll strategy. Government strategy, and for strategy for sitting out of power. Defense strategy, attack strategy. Tourism strategy, strategy for job creation. Remarkably, there was a save the coconut strategy. Business strategy. In business strategy, a lot of conversation on urban strategy, rural strategy. And newly, a word that everyone seems to think in India called as rurban strategy, which is rural urban strategy. Much of the conversation around IT strategy and digital strategy. The list is long. This was just the first screen. So, we could extend this and we start realizing that this is a word that is much used and honestly much misused. I feel that people feel that the moment they add to any two other sets of words, the word strategy, it gives it some kind of importance. And so we can just sort of, throw it around. Any activity list, any plan of action that we have, we add the word strategy to it, it somehow gives it weight and importance. But the fact of the matter is any list of activities or plan of action is not a strategy. And hence this list that I've read, for me, broadly falls under three. The first being just an activity list. It's a wish list. It's a list that you prepared and you want to add the word strategy and you think you're going to do it. The second, I'll give a little bit more of benefit of doubt. Inadvertently, they may actually be thinking about a strategy, the way I would, and I'll get to the definition. It's happenstance, and the most likely possibility when it's happenstance is that it's going to fail. So if you've really not thought about the different elements that go into what makes a good strategy, and you just hit upon it, there's a very strong likelihood that it may not survive. It will fail. And the last one, which is actually the minority of the cases, would actually fall into what I would consider is really strategy. I honestly, let me be very clear. I don't mean to demean when the word is used or an activity list. They're all important. But to me, that's not a strategy. Right? And the confusion is valid. If you actually go again and, into a Wikipedia kind of thing, which everyone likes to use, and put the word strategy, and I'll actually read this. A strategy is a plan of action designed to achieve a long-term or overall aim. And this is part of the problem with regards to what we would consider as strategy. And please be patient with me here, because this is the one time I'll actually get a little technical, if I may. So what do I consider as strategy? A good strategy is an integrated set of choices that positions an entity to win. And I've underlined 4 words, and I'll go through them, and I'll choose the order that I like so that I can actually make my point across. And I'll use a few illustrative examples. The first being choices. Strategy is essentially about making choices, which simply means choosing one from a range of options. When we choose to do something which gets us closer to our objectives, you necessarily, let me stress this, choose not to do some things. Ideally, these choices are made based on a set of knowledge, data, experience leading to intuition, not because I have a hunch, not because I have not thought of the other set of choices. Let's make this real. If the goal for Goa, I don't want to make this polemic, is to create high-paying jobs, we have multiple options to do that. We could get into a manufacturing sector, but more at the higher end. Technology manufacturing, silicon-based manufacturing, very high-end manufacturing. I could have another option. I could get into a high-end services industry model. Right? So I could go along the path of industrialization at a very high level, or I could go along the path of creating a service-based industry on a very high level. Making no choice and leaving it, or choosing both, is actually not a strategy. And every time, and pardon me for saying this, but every time I've seen a vision document created for Goa, this is the one element which actually falls apart. We create a long list of everything we want to do. Let me make this very simple, and let's take a very illustrative example. I emphasize the word illustrative, so if anyone wants to have a debate, I'm happy to have it afterwards. If you take a company such as AirAsia, a low-cost carrier, when they've chosen to be a low-cost carrier, they have necessarily eliminated all the business customers. They have made a choice that says we are going to focus on a specific segment and serve them with a certain set of services. And by doing that, they are necessarily going to not serve a certain part of the market. Right? It's deliberate. It is made with a certain set of things in mind. Now let me move to the second part, which is about positions. Strategy, once thought about as the choice that you want to make, is necessarily about making bets. It's about allocating resources. If not, it is just an intent. And I'll make this much simpler without going to companies. If my objective is to lose weight, and I choose the strategy of eating less and exercising more, That will just stay as an intent unless I make sure that I'm willing to put in the time every single day, the mind space and discipline every single day. So I'm going to allocate resources to make sure that happens. Otherwise, it's just an intent statement. It's not a strategy. Taking on that example of AirAsia, just saying that we want to be a low-cost carrier and serve a certain part of the market doesn't help. I need to be able to allocate resources to make sure that my operations are lean. I am not spending more than I need to. And that is about taking a position. So I'm putting some weight behind whatever choice I'm making. I have to do that. I cannot make an intent statement and say, well, it's going to take care of itself. It's about taking a position, allocating time and money resources. Just as an aside, just like all good entities, most people also, I think, have the general intention of having a very fulfilling life. But high achievers and high performers, the only difference is that they end up allocating resources behind that intent of having a better life and a better company. The third is integrated. The choices we make, the options we choose, they need to be cogent. They need to be cohesive. They need to be consistent. They need to be coherent. Going back to my AirAsia example, all the choices that they choose to make to give a low-cost strategy must be consistent with that strategy chosen of being low-cost. I cannot have a high-priced call center. So if you actually get bad responses from AirAsia, it's part of a coherent strategy. They do not want to put more resources than necessary to safely get you from point A to point B. So they may invest in maintenance, they may invest in the basic cleanliness, but the rest is not. That's coherent. What would be incoherent is, for me, what Kingfisher did, which was put in the best of uniform, pay the highest of salaries, and while thinking that we were going to serve an audience that actually is not willing to pay a lot. So these choices that we make need to be integrated and coherent. If we don't do this, once again, strategy falls apart. It becomes a wish list, and wish list is allowed to have conflicts. A strategy is coherent. And the final element is winning. We don't want to have a strategy to be mediocre and also be an also-ran. It is necessarily about beating the competition. It's necessarily about playing hardball. It's necessarily about being and coming out ahead of the next. We like to put it this way, it's not for the faint-hearted. There is no second and third and fourth winners in strategy. It's about trying to make sure that you are going to be a winner. This is about beating the competition. In summary, if I were to put it this way, strategy is the art of figuring out where do you play consistently, and then how do you win. Whatever bets you need to make are about understanding where do I play this game, and then about understanding how do I win. The starting point becomes very critical, because where I play becomes a set of where is my DNA, what am I good at, and how do I win is about then how can I leverage this to make sure that I am the best, I am going to beat the competition. As I mentioned in the beginning, strategy started probably in two places. The first one, very rudimentary. The second one is where I think the seeds of strategy really lie. When the caveman decided to hunt a quarry, an animal, they couldn't do it alone. They figured that out very quickly. And so you got to go group together to actually chase up this. And you needed to think about it, because animals are quite stealthy and fast, and they know how to react. They react to stimulus. And this is when the first elements of strategy came up. But when you actually were trying to figure out, how do I capture this animal? You had to come up with a set of thoughts. Should we distract them on one side and someone attack from the other side? Should I use a bow and an arrow and shoot them? Is it then edible? So you had to think about options. But the fact that the animal per se cannot actually have their own strategy makes it very rudimentary. And hence probably the first awakenings of real strategy came about when one tribe tried to take over another tribe. This is when you knew that the other tribe would have a response strategy as well. It was quite interesting. It's the same way companies work today. It's the same way we as individuals work today. You do not expect when you take a decision that the other side is going to keep quiet. And hence, the real seeds of strategy started, as I said, in a way, in war and battle. And so one had to think through, how were you going to take over another tribe? And hence, if many of you have read, the ultimate treatise on war was written by a Chinese general, Sun Tzu, called The Art of War. He wrote it in 13 chapters, and he was finally made the general. He led them to war, he won, and he wrote this book, which is considered by many and is required reading in most army manuals, on how do you fight wars. He laid out extensively what were the strategies of attack, what were the strategies of defense. And he came up with some of the classics which are even applicable today to us, to war, and to business. All warfare is based on deception. This was one of Sun Tzu's classics. Today it has been coming down to elements of perception, marketing. Because it's not necessary when you go into a marketing campaign that you're telling the full truth. Right? He also came up with, to fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. So to fight and conquer is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in breaking down your enemy's resistance without fighting. And the classic by Henry Kissinger, which is sort of taken off from here, which is, war is an extension of foreign policy. And hence, in these classics of Sun Tzu were some of the basics of what we would consider strategy. Let me make it a little bit more pop culture. And I'm a huge fan of this. Francis Ford Coppola's Godfather. Multi-Oscar winner movie from the 70s, based on the mafia on the East Coast of the United States. What actually, if you go into the basics of this novel, is you start realizing that this is not a novel necessarily about the mafia. This is about the strategy of how to gain power. This is about the strategy of domination. His principles were very similar to what you use as strategy to gain and win. At some point of time, I think during his research, he came across the mafia, was fascinated with Italy, and decided to use that as the basis for making a few points. He could have well have written a romance novel or a book on business. The principles that are expounded in a horrific and violent, that must be condemned, book such as The Godfather, Mario Puzo basically was talking about the rules of strategy. It's a study, a very bizarre one at that, as to what are the strategies of gaining power, and through that, market domination. Let me give you two examples of what I thought were very cunning strategies and thinking that is even applicable today in the business environment. Please treat this with a sense of humor. I do not want to encourage anyone into any kind of gangster activities. For one, trading in services is always more profitable than trading in products, or even trading in money. Don Corleone, whenever possible, traded in favors. He never took money, because for him, trading in favors was the highest currency that you could have. It was a service that had no definable value. Second, recognize market shifts early and respond to them quickly. Don Corleone got rich on gambling and prostitution. And if you see the movie, there's a part of the movie where you start seeing that the market is moving towards drugs in the mafia. And that was the more lucrative business to get into. But he faces the classic dilemma every business enterprise, every businessman faces. Should I make and allocate resources to that new bet? Or should I protect my turf, because this is where I think the money is going to continue to be? He fears and he toils with that he's going to damage his own business, which he believes in. In the end, and this is where the book goes, he loses both. He actually loses out on the market that he's present in, and he actually doesn't get a foothold in the market that he gets into. And there's many such things. Another of the ones that I find a classic is that the way to the downfall of the Don in that movie goes through incredibly insignificant events. A couple of the most low end of the resources are poached by the fighting families. When Don Corleone does not respond, the competition is emboldened. This is when they decide that they are going to go from some of the more trusted lieutenants of Don Corleone. And this is the beginning of the end. This is the same logic when we think about our own companies, when we think about our own enterprises. We may think of some insignificant events, insignificant people who may not be there. But maybe the extrapolation of that is the beginning of the end. Why is strategy even more important today? And I'll use this with a few slides on this one because I really want to make this point. Have you heard of the word VUCA? V-U-C-A. The world today is more volatile. The world today is more uncertain. The world today is more complex. And the world today is more ambiguous. And hence the word VUCA. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. This was a word that was coined by the US intelligence agencies post the fall of the Berlin Wall. The world was wonderful and nice and simple before 1989. There was one enemy, that was Russia. The world was bipolar, dichotomous, very unambiguous. Everyone knew who the bad guys were in the world, and everyone knew who the good guys were. And there were a few like us in India who decided something called a non-aligned movement. But in general, the world was simple. With the fall of the wall, the US intelligence agency were in complete disarray. They did not know how to respond. All of a sudden, are the Russians our friends or our foes? And hence they came out with this. The world is volatile, the world is more complex, the world is more uncertain, and the world is more ambiguous. And I posit that what was applicable post 1989 is equally true today in the business world and in the world where we need to think about strategy. First is volatility. And I know this looks a little bizarre, but the fact of the matter is, most companies today have extreme variations in their positioning in the market. Companies that were leaders become laggards very quickly. Companies that were laggards become leaders very quickly. The pace at which that's happening, the volatility with which that's happening is actually increasing dramatically. So the size of this thing that I'm showing you, moving from left to right, is actually letting you know, moving from the 1960s to the 2000s, that size reflects that there is extreme volatility going on in the market cap of companies, which means that if you're sitting on the board of a company taking decisions, it is becoming very volatile. Last year you were the leader, this year you may be at the bottom of the pile. This is actually even more elucidative. If you look at the extreme left side, if I was a market leader in 1960, it is extremely likely in 1969 I was within the top 3. The fact that is going down, it actually shows you, this is actually real hardcore research studying all the companies that are traded in the world. There is no way that you can actually predict that if you are a market leader, if you are sitting at the top and you're so comfortable with your strategy that you're going to continue to be a market leader. The world has become very uncertain. We are in a business environment, whether it is because of policy, whether it is because of geopolitics, whether it is just because of competition and the change in technology that's coming up. The future has become more unclear. The constant uncertainty, the constant changes, the constant, almost if I were to say, mood swings in the global environment have created a climate of extreme uncertainty. And how do we then take decisions in this uncertainty? And in this uncertainty, the gap between people and companies who were winners and people who were losers has just become worse. So the price of being a loser has just gone up. While the top company and the bottom company in the past could both have survived, being a bottom company today is not a choice. If we don't have the right set of strategy and strategic choices, the likelihood that our ability to survive in the market is actually very low. The third element is complexity. As economies grow, the normal tendency is to make things more complex. We have more policies, we have more laws, we have more systems, we have more processes, we have more rules that we need to be thinking about. It's just getting more and more complex. In fact, I like to say is that the more complex we get, our responses have not just become complex, they've become complicated. We are no more in a position to even fathom and figure out how to deal with complexity. Instead of making things simple and linear and responding in a way that is manageable, we respond in a way that is complicated. In fact, because that's the easy way out. Every time a problem comes out, instead of actually taking a step back and trying to solve it in an integrated, comprehensive way, we decide to do something that is of a mushroom solution. And this makes the world far more complex. The last is ambiguity. And I'll take this to a place that is actually a little bit more dear to me, which is oil and gas. When I look at the emergence of renewables, when I look at the emergence of an electric car, when I look at the emergence of new fuel technologies, we are faced with a world that is unprecedented in what we call unknown unknowns. The world knows how to deal with known knowns, unknown knowns, known unknowns, but the world of unknown unknowns is very complex. We are in a completely unambiguous situation. We don't know where this is headed, but we also don't know how to respond to it. And hence this VUCA world, as I've put across, I really think is the new normal. To think in some way we're going to go back to the lovely 60s, where everything was unambiguous, everything was certain, is not happening. And hence we must learn to adapt to this new world. But it throws up great opportunities. And this world and the way we are going to strategize in this world is actually going to really decide on the winners and the losers. So let me take a few minutes to talk about what is the latest thinking in strategy. I hope I've convinced you that strategy is important. It is more important than ever before. There was a time when our responses could have been more simple, but in a world that is ever more complex, ever more uncertain, strategy becomes even more fundamental. Now, we are in an era of unprecedented globalization, rapid technological changes, and an economic interconnectedness which have far exceeded anything we expected in the past. Things are changing faster and more uncertain than ever. Strategy under stable conditions relied on things that were much simpler, and we've all heard about this. Relied on scale. If we were bigger, the natural consequence of it was we were better. If we had done this for a long time, our experience was good, we were likely going to win. But in a world in which the turbulence is far greater, more unpredictable, these lines of actually taking these long static positions, let me take it based on some past capability that I have built. Let me take decisions that are strategic based on just becoming bigger in size, are no more valid. The world is more dynamic. Adaptive capabilities is the way forward. The traditional market, as I said, was be big, be well positioned in the market, and there's nothing to worry about. Our first order capabilities, I was good at it, is good enough. That's, as I said, much more of a static world. In the dynamic world, we must fundamentally ask the question, how can we adapt? How can we learn from change faster than our competition? Remember, the goal is to be better than your competition. The traditional mantra was, how do you create sustainable long-term competitive advantage? How can I be better than my competition for a very long time? That doesn't work anymore. What we need to start asking the question is, how can I become a serial temporary advantage creator? So I can do better this year through a certain set of rules. I need to get into another set of rules the next year because the rules may be completely different. So instead of thinking what position can I take that's going to keep me on the top for a long time, it's about saying, how can I create the capabilities and adaptiveness that allows me to become a serial advantage creator? And we think about 5 styles, and I will try to be very brief about this, but this is really where strategy has really taken off to the next level. And I will use a few examples. The world is more unpredictable, as I said, and the ability of companies to shape some of the environment that they're in. I can be a leader, I can decide what the price is actually very low. The market is not very malleable to what you may think you want to do. And the last part is, certain sectors and industry are in a much harsher environment than others. Let us take an example of newspapers. This is an industry that is now in the midst of an incredibly harsh crisis, thanks to the internet, thanks to the media revolution that's taking place. So you're in an incredibly harsh environment. You cannot even shape the market you're in. You cannot even almost decide the price you want to charge for your newspaper. And it's probably a little bit more predictable because we know where that is headed. And hence we have 5 types of styles that we need to think about strategy. And hence, depending on where we are, the type of industry we're in, we need to start thinking about it. There's always going to be the classical. If I know how the market works and I have the ability to shape it a little bit, it's classical. Maybe I need to put big factories. This is what the Chinese did. They are in those sectors and dominating those sectors where they can use classical principles of strategy, size, scale, basic capability building, experience, matter. We can go with that. A very, very good example of this is Mars and M&M chocolates, market leaders in their category. Very low unpredictability. They know people eat chocolates. They know it's a market that has been very steady. They do not need to be thinking about anything. It's about taking specific positions. It's about rigorous planning. It's about actually deep analytical capabilities associated with understanding customer and customer tastes and making bets. And they've been very successful with it. So there is the classical. The second is the adaptive. We don't know. It is very unpredictable to be here. And our ability to actually affect the industry or the sector is actually very low. We have a situation such as TCS, one of the most successful Indian companies in the IT sector. The market is unpredictable. There's a change in technology. There's a change in what customers want. And the malleability is low. It's a very fragmented market. So one leader cannot decide how the market is going to be shaped. And so they have internally this thing called as the 4E philosophy, where they're continuously adaptive. It's a learning organization. They explore, they enable their people, they exploit who are the winners, and they evangelize, and hence they take it forward. It's a very adaptive company. The other two, and I'm not going to get into the details of those two, are how can you be visionary? In an environment in which you can shape it, and it's reasonably predictable, you can be visionary. In an environment in which you can shape it, and it is unpredictable, you can actually create that market. When Alibaba in China, which everyone knows, created that marketplace, it was a huge leap of faith. No one knew that marketplaces existed. No one knew how even to create marketplaces. But they took that leap of faith. They shaped an entire industry. And hence, what we need to think about is what is really applicable to us in each of these styles. What really matters to us, and there is no one fixed idea. In a given year, I may choose to be adaptive. In the next year, I may have to choose to make a classical position. Industries evolve, they evolve faster than before. Industries get more complex. And hence we need to be able to think, what is relevant to us? And we need to have a continuous eye on these 3 aspects. Is this predictable? Can I shape it? And is the environment getting harder and tougher for everyone, not just myself? And hence, when we think about how do you create advantage, I want to add 5 new parts which are very, very important for companies to start thinking about as to how do you create advantage. The traditional one was size, and I had a specific capability. Today, there are 5 new ones. One is called a signal advantage. This is, do I have the ability to read the right signals from the market? And for anyone who's an engineer will remember there's a classic thing called signal to noise ratio. If I have a better ability to sift through the signals, take out the noise, I actually have a competitive advantage. The second is if we can figure out the economics of experimentation. And this will take me to my next section very briefly, and I'll put that across. More and more, the bets cannot be for multi-year periods, forget multi-decades. More and more, it's about experimentation. And if I can create the model that allows me to experiment cheaply, what does this simply mean? I should be able to launch 5 products cheaply instead of 1. I should be able to kill 4 of them very quickly. And if I can get this economics right, I am the winner. Because the certainty associated with one product is not there anymore. So if I've created an advantage, if I've created the dynamics within my company of how can I become good at experimenting, this is actually becoming a huge competitive advantage. The third is organization, creating the flexibilities within the organization. And a very classic case for this is Netflix. Netflix's motto almost is that we will allow you to experiment. We don't care as much for the rules and guidelines of human resources department. But we want you to culturally experiment. And they've built that flexibility into everything associated with their business. And hence you can create an advantage to the way you structure your organization, the culture that you want to embed into that organization. The fourth is system advantage, and this everyone knows. This is the game that Apple played. You create a coalition rather than you thinking of yourself as a company. Everyone who called it the ecosystem, right? So they gave you the holistic experience on one device. It was the ecosystem that mattered, not the phone. And they created a huge amount of advantage based on that. And finally, one that is taking shape, which everyone is struggling with, is an advantage based on taking benefits through a broader coalition of social interaction and social media within a broader ecological context of sustainability. These are the players of the new social media. You know, the type of games Nintendo is launching. I mean, it's quite remarkable how much they've been able to create business models out of it. A Pokemon Go has become incredibly valuable. It's a craze. And hence they're exploiting this new world of social media that we've gone along with sustainability principles and creating a winning business model. And it's a huge advantage. Hence, if I were to put it across, organizations need to be constantly aware of where do they want to place their bets in these 5 broad styles of strategy. And they need to be constantly aware of how, very clearly, how are they creating advantage for themselves. This is not about copying. This is about taking a hard look inside. So if I were to summarize, if I were to say what would be the mantras for success going forward, you must be outward looking, not inward looking. It's not about your capabilities. It's about what someone else wants. And it's about what someone else is doing. We must change our attitudes towards failure. Companies that are adaptive and adopt adaptive strategies do not punish failure. It's not that they reward failure. That's not what I'm trying to say. But they reward experimentation. You have to figure out how do you not punish failure. Third, you must create a culture of constructive dissent. This is not about being constantly against something, but it is about creating the element that says, let us genuinely try to look at multiple options. The top person in the room is not necessarily the person who has it right. And dissent should be encouraged. And the last, if you may permit me, because this is becoming fundamental if you look at my other 5 areas of of creating advantage, is create a fearless culture of playfulness. Because playfulness and the way children do things is at the heart of experimentation. I'm sure some of you have heard of this, but I will tell this, in every business program, there is this game that is played that is called as the spaghetti and marshmallow game. I'll take a minute off that. And it's very simple. They'll give you a lot of hard spaghetti, a lot of threads, and a marshmallow. So marshmallow is pretty light. Marshmallow is this American little sweet that sits. And they're given 20 minutes, and they're asked to construct the highest tower that they can. Right? Now, and this experiment has been run now, I think, hundreds of thousands of times, so there is now very good data. I hope I'm not going to offend anyone here, but do you know the category of people who actually get the shortest tower? Close, it's the second from the bottom. The bottom are actually the people with MBAs. The second from the bottom are CEOs. But CEOs with their executive assistants actually do much better. Do you know the top two? The number one are architects and design people. Do you know what's the number two? First grade children. Because the way they work is, the MBAs are all trying to figure out the right strategy and who is the leader and who is the follower and what are the principles and the whole thing, and in 20 minutes you get nowhere. We have limited resources. It is the real world. Children experiment. They fight, they'll do whatever, they stick it together, it falls apart, they do something more, they keep trying, it falls apart far more than any other group. And hence actually bringing this culture of playfulness is an integral part of how we want to build competitive advantage. I will actually take just another 5 minutes, if it's okay, to actually close out on a topic that I think will actually dramatically disrupt the life of our lives going forward. Whether it is individuals, whether it is corporations, whether it is entities, whether it is states, whether it is cities, whether it is towns, it is not going to be something that we're going to be able to ignore. And I'm not saying we're ignoring it. And I'll actually play this through a video for you. They've not yet been able to take away the sunglasses, if you've realized. But there's another point I want to make. In this 1 minute that we watch this video, I'll call it 1 internet minute, this is exactly what happened. This is the pace at which things are moving. This is the pace at which things are changing. There were 1,003 new mobile users. There were 204 million emails sent. There were 6 new Wikipedia articles written. There were 100 new LinkedIn accounts. Amazon sold $83,000 of goods. There were 61,000 hours of music that was uploaded. There were 47,000 apps that were downloaded on the Apple Store. There were 2 million plus search queries. There were 320 new Twitter accounts and 100,000 new tweets in this 1 minute that you were watching that video. There were 3,000 photo uploads, 20 million photo views. 277,000 logins, 6 million Facebook views. I don't know about you, but this scares me. This is the pace and rate at which the world is changing. And we don't have a choice. 50 years back, not knowing to read and write made it very difficult for you to have a living. I posit, 10 years from now, if you're not digitally literate, you are going to find it incredibly difficult to be able to do anything. And I really mean anything. You will not be able to file your tax records. Not that we want to, but you will not be able to. You may have extreme difficulty in dealing with your healthcare records. And you may have extreme difficulty in engaging either in commercial activity or civic activity with the states. And hence, 5 or 6 technologies are actually radically going to be changing the way we think at it, and every company needs to incorporate this into their strategic thinking. And this is where I'll leave off the audience with a few set of questions rather than answers. I'm leaving these as what I would call as the trends going forward that are going to dramatically impact our lives. Big data and how we look at it. Shifting to the cloud, augmented reality, new generation of sensors, ubiquitous connectivity, new devices, the Internet of Things, and 3D printing. While this seems very technology related, this has far-reaching implications and ramifications for every aspect of our lives, every business that we run, and hence something that we all need to take attention to. And what it has done, and I want to use this as a metaphor, has completely changed the way how companies are thinking about running businesses, launching products, everything. And the metaphor is very simple. In the past, when we wanted to get from point A to point B, you needed, maybe if the distance was large, a car. And the way a car was made was that you had one wheel, you had 2 wheels, you put in the axle, you put in your gearbox, you put the chassis on, you put the electronics and everything, and hence you had a car. This process could take 1 day, 3 days, 15 days, 30 days, 2 years. Then you got into the car and drove. The new way the world works, and when you think about strategy, is that you don't wait to build a car. You said, if I want to get from point A to point B, let me start the journey now with maybe a skateboard. I may then add a little thing to the top of it which helps me steer a little bit. Maybe the next step is a bicycle. The question people are asking today is, how fast can you go to market? And how fast, the concept is called, how fast can I get a minimally viable product that allows me to go from my existing state to my new reality, to my preferred reality. The car may come later, and it will even be a jet engine. But this gives me fundamentally the ability to be adaptive. I can change my direction. If when I'm doing a bicycle, I realize the distance is very short, maybe all I need is a motor for the bicycle. And then I can do in a very cost-effective way, produce that. That's what the market wants. But if I realize at that point of time the direction needs to be changed, I need to be able to do that. But if you set up a line based on size and scale that is only about manufacturing cars, you've actually outpriced yourself, outpaced yourself out of the market. And hence, this is the new way how one must think about strategy. It's not like building a car anymore. It's about understanding the purpose it serves is going from point A to point B, and there's many ways to do it. Let me end this with another video. This is very important. So I'll leave you with 3 thoughts. More questions, I guess. The first one is follow Mario Andretti's philosophy. If you think everything is under our control, you're probably just not going fast enough. The second is fail fast, fail often. And thirdly, don't think increments, think step change. Think disruption. Think factor of X, X being far larger than a small percentage. Okay? With that, I'll stop and I'll take any questions.
Sir, when Salil mentioned your topic to me, the question which I had in my mind, which I didn't ask Salil, why you have given this topic the name, the art of strategy. It seems to be a social science. Why not science?
So, it's a very good question. The way I think about science in the past, I guess I have been a person of science, is that there's a set of rules that guide you to a certain direction. And I think maybe the point you're making where it's a social science is probably more applicable as well. But I think your ability today to actually read uncertainty, because there is no complete data sets, there is no complete knowledge that exists. It has become an art to be able to figure out where your advantage really lies. And I would say it's not just an art, I think it's a great combination of a very strong science, which has got a lot of set of strong principles, with an art. So I guess I was taking poetic license in calling it the art of strategy alone. I would say it's a great combination of having strong science, whether you want to call it social science, principles, with an element of actually art. And I actually honestly, and pardon me for being this, I think there's a certain beauty in the way strategy gets defined, and probably that's why I want to call it as an art as well.
This strategy is riding on the busy tiger's back and keep tiger busy to move throughout. Once the tiger stops, he will swallow the rider. Yeah. And other thing is that every organization have first strategy to survive the organization, then other strategies. Then that organization will serve. Second, in Second World War, Hitler invaded British Empire. His generals advised that the Third Reich is very weaker than the British Empire. But Hitler's strategy said that British army has given defensive training. They have not given aggressive training. British will never aggress. And in Second World War, British soldiers never fired a single bullet aggressively. All the bullets has fired defensively. Other one, recently China has financed Guatemala and Thailand to dig channels parallel to the Panama Canal, which is another channel in Thailand. It will reduce the importance of the Singapore as well as Panama Channel. What is the question?
What is the question?
No, I think it's a set of comments. I think
Yeah.
very well appreciated.
Rahool, how do you analyze the dispute within Tata's family, Tata's business?
This is the type of question that typically gets you into trouble. So I'll give a few thoughts. I don't know the answer. I mean, whoever's sitting in that boardroom is the only person who knows the answer. The reading from the outside is, companies such as Tata's, the emphasis on culture is very high. And it's a culture that they have designed over centuries, over generations. It's the fifth generation now of Tata's that is at the helm. And the culture has inherently, whether it was stated or not, been about a broader interpretation of shareholder value. Right? So, as a pure, what I would consider myself a technocrat in strategy, I like to say, generation of shareholder value, or in a broader sense, stakeholder value, is very critical. See, the Tatas have always been, stated or not, very reluctant to just focus on one element of how do you create value. They've just had a very broad perspective. So I think when a new culture came in where let's completely make this mathematically driven, this company is not generating value, let's close it down, this company is where we need to focus. I think there was a general clash of cultures. And that's the broad seeds of where it starts. The ramifications are governance, the ramifications are there, the boardroom fights and all that. But I think broadly speaking, if I were to interpret that, this is where the genesis is. Because I think between Mr. Ratan Tata and the way he was, and Mr. Mistry and the direction he was taking it in, I think there was a significant disparity in the way they were looking at things for the future. And needless to say, in any of these, we are very human. Personalities matter as well. And so somehow to think that the hallowed boardroom of the Tatas does not have personality clashes, I think is not fair. Yeah.
In a fast-moving world, fast-changing world, a lot of accidents also are expected. What any tips for the teachers and students in raising their children?
So, my singular one is the second line here. Accidents per se are not bad. In fact, as I have pointed out, fail fast, fail often. So, what you're calling accidents is the same way I consider, a mistake. We need to find, as a corporate, because the world can be quite unforgiving, as you've pointed out, we need to find a way of actually reducing the cost of an accident. And I don't mean it literally an accident, the cost of a failure. The cost of experimentation and failing has to get reduced. So if you're talking about teachers or students, this is the same way. It is about saying, you have a passion, you think you're feeling good at, go after it. But create the mechanisms in which you can fail quickly, fail fast, and take the corrective measure. Because to think for some reason that today we are in a world in which you can define that trajectory for the next 10 or 15 years, I think is not a realistic assumption. So if I were to give one advice is to say, okay, experiment, fail if you have to, make those mistakes, but make sure that you are keeping yourself, that cost of making that mistake is small enough that you can quickly get up and move forward. But in fact, I actually consider not this as advice if I were to think it, I think it's essential these days to think that corporations, people, any one of us has that complete clarity of exactly what the answer is and where we are headed to, I think is very difficult. Like I said, the world is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. We have less answers and more questions. Yeah.
How do you rate the new Tata chief, Chandrasekhar?
I am not qualified.
Do you recommend, which book would you recommend us to read on strategy?
So there is one called The Art of Strategy.
Small question. J.R.D. Tata was asked one day, would you like India to be superpower? He said, no, I want India to be the happiest country. Now my question is, will this digital revolution make India or make any country or humanity happy?
I think this is a very loaded question, a very important question. In all honesty, let me put it this way. I don't think the world has thought enough of the ramifications of the direction we are headed in. Whether it's the digital world or whether it's the technological changes that are coming about at a rapid pace, I don't think the world is taking enough of a time and a pause to say what are the moral, ethical, legal implications of the direction we are moving in. And hence, the question of, I think this is what they say, we live in the era of Arthashastra, right? It's all about wealth and it's all about wealth creation. Happiness has taken a sort of a backseat somewhere. Somehow the logic has become, somehow you'll make more money, you'll be more happy. Nothing could be further from the truth, as we all know. And countries have stopped measuring themselves, except, as everyone knows, Bhutan. Bhutan is the only country, as everyone knows, actually does not measure GDP. They measure whatever they call GNH, or Gross National Happiness Index, or whatever it is, right? But most countries have given up. I think this has come down to the level of individuals. But sooner or later, I think my view is that governments, companies less, they'll be the last to do this, trust me on this one. Governments, legislative bodies will start having to debate on this aspect of what are the social, cultural, ethical, moral ramifications of technology and digital. And I don't think there's enough debate going on that. And so to answer your question in very simple terms, I don't think anyone knows. And history has time and time again proven that you can't leave it to the people to finally figure it out. We will inevitably probably go down on a wrong path at some point in time. So I think the answer is still out. The verdict is still out. I don't think we know enough to actually say, is this going to make us happier or not? Yeah.
All the way that you are talking about the art, but what I feel, all these things that what you are talking is a totally calculated things in certain on certain situation. So it may be at the most scientific way or a technique, but how it can be an art? Because art is always unbounded and limitless. So are you making the art in a very particular definition, which is a very limited one?
So obviously one is limited. Maybe it is to be provocative in a way, but let me actually contest that as well. So in the volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world, there is only so much you can predict and be predicted about. Data does not answer it. There is a limit to where the certainty takes you. The rest of how do you define strategy has got to do with the limitless thinking that you're pointing out that has got to do with us. And which is why companies actually do better or not. If all of us had the same set of data and it was that predictable, there would be no losers because we would all take the scientific decision. It would come to an x equal to 5 answer and everyone knew what the answer was. It is because of the uncertainty, it is because of the lack of data, it is because of the lack of information and knowledge that part of it is actually art.
But ultimately, the goal is a very limited one, whether it is a big or small.
Not true. If you think for a corporation, maybe. Let me just cut as a result. And so maybe part of what I'm talking about, and maybe I'm giving the impression it's only about corporations and entities, which has got to do with stakeholder value and all that. No, it is about any objective. It is any objective one can set yourselves to. It has got less to do with an individual goal alone. At least that's what I would posit. Am I getting kicked off the stage?
Is it not the creative things are more?
I'm kidding.
No, in art there is more creativity, and that creativity is here when it is everything is calculated.
No.
Everything is calculated.
So this is the point I'm contesting is everything is calculated. The reason why I've actually even provocatively called it art is that the element of creativity today in defining strategy is very high. When I've talked about you need to think about multiple options, if it's going from point A to point B, I just gave you 2 pathways. Your creativity should give me another 50. And which is why, because I don't have certain data of what everything should be about. And hence, creativity today plays a much stronger role in actually defining strategy. And in a way, you're actually putting the argument exactly where I wanted, that science will only take you so far.
Yeah, Mr. Rahool, from last row, last question possibly. There are 2 questions actually. One, you mentioned about the GDP of Singapore and Goa. So being you are born and brought up in Goa and now you are doing extremely well. I would say a master in the art of strategy. How could you help Goa to at least come to some good GDP compared to Singapore? And the other is that the new US president, Mr. Trump, recently, I read somewhere, he is saying that you better write letters than using mails. So how you interpret this?
I didn't quite get the second one.
The new US president, in one of his speech or somewhere he mentioned that you write letters rather than sending mails, because mails are not, a reliable source of exchanging, writing confidential matter.
So I think he's stating it in the context of where I think he benefited in their election thanks to the Russians. So I think he's trying to be sarcastic as well. I don't think we have a choice on that one. To answer your first question, thank you for actually complimenting me that I'm doing very well in life. I'm not so sure, but so with regards to Goa, as all Goans, you can take Goans out of Goa, but you can never take Goanness out of a Goan kind of thing. I'm always, the heart is here, always ready to help. Goa is in a very complex place, as everyone knows. In that VUCA framework, I think it would fit very well. We've had more governments, more uncertainty, more complexity, and more ambiguity than most other places. So yeah, and hence more than ever, Goa needs a strategy. But it's not easy. I think, and, this is not passing judgment at all. And I do not even want to make the presumption that I know how to solve Goa's issues or put us on a path to Singapore. But I do believe that almost bipartisanly, or in the current elections tripartisanly, or however many parties need to work together to go through this exercise. I think no one is ever stopping, because it's not difficult. I do not want to put across a point that said, making a strategy or creating a strategy is difficult. It is about having the discipline and the dedication to do that. So first and foremost, if you're talking of a nation or state of Goa, there has to be the political will, which is where many of us actually step out, right? I mean, we are professionals and technocrats. We follow logic and rationale, and even when we are doing art, there is a reasoning behind it, and hence I think what is really needed to start with is the political will. The second thing is, when we're talking of a strategy for a nation state, one has to fundamentally understand what problem you're trying to solve. Is it happiness? Is it GDP? Is it a broader sustainability issue? And hence we need to think that. And post that, there is a very important thing that is, this is where many entities, institutions, countries fail. We need to have a very hard look inwards. What are we really good at? Just because Singapore went on that strategy doesn't mean we can do it. We need to fundamentally understand what as Goa and Goans are we good at. And hence, using my definition of strategy, put all our bets and resources there. Trying to be a port city, trying to be a steel manufacturer, trying to be an industrial hub, trying to be a services center, trying to do everything is not a strategy. And I think, given resources are limited, as a government you need to step back and say, what are my 3 bets? Right? If I were to put it in a very high level, the government needs to think, how do we build the ecosystem of building capabilities in Goa? Whether it's educational institutions, whether it's attracting talent, whether it's retaining talent. Right? This is becoming fundamental. And the second, if you ask me, is how do I facilitate and get out of the way of entrepreneurs and business? And as you can tell, both these points are quite contrary to the way in which direction in which we are going. So, yeah.
What is the strategy India should adopt to make the digital revolution a success?
So long debate. We could talk hours on this one. But I'll give you one thing, which is, honestly, India is actually on a very good path on the digital thing. The way the word digital works and the way we like to visualize it is a concept called as stacks. And the government needs to think only a certain amount of the stacks, and then you leave the remaining stacks together. What do we mean by stacks? And so I'll give you an example very concretely. Aadhaar card. Aadhaar card, we may have not realized, maybe it was even painful for some of you to go and get your Aadhaar card, is one of the most radical digital stacks that has been created. So 2 things the government needs to do. Create infrastructure. If I was someone in Goa to add to that question, make Goa a plug-and-play state. What does that mean? Anyone who wants to come here should actually, literally, when I say plug-and-play, it's an expression used by people using games, right? I should be able to come here, stick my plug into something, and I should have the best of infrastructure available to me. First, right? Basic infrastructure, technology infrastructure. There is no going around it. So when you're talking digital today, if you're not willing to create that infrastructure, it's a joke. And I will use the word very harshly, joke. We are very proud and we beat on our chests about how amazing things have been. If you actually look at the quality of the internet connectivity, it is not going to get us, forget digital, it is not going to get us anywhere. Right, so first and foremost. The second is you want to create the processes and the systems that allow people to become good entrepreneurs, which is basically stay out of the way. As someone basically said, the only reason the IT revolution happened in India is because the government at that time did not know how to regulate it. And the same thing needs to happen again in a way. So, you allow the creativity of the entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurial spirit, which in India is not short. We are amazing entrepreneurs. We go all over the world and creating amazing businesses. It's just that we don't do it here because, how do you create the ecosystem there? So the government is about just if the government can do those 2 steps, make it a plug and play situation, and stay out of the way in terms of putting in more and more regulation. I think you're a huge step ahead. And they can help build these stacks. Aadhaar is one of them. The payment system is going to be the next stack, which is going to be absolutely critical. For those who are into the of this thing, there's this whole thing called blockchain architecture that they're building on a payment system. So that's going to be the next step. The third that the government can be thinking about in the digital space is healthcare stack. If you can get these three things, you are going to affect the life dramatically of 90% of our population. And then leave it to the creativity of the business people to create business models on the top of these three stacks. But it simply means that if I could get the data on people, their health, and some of these other parameters, and you create the hard infrastructure behind it, it is very easy to create amazing business models that are going to be delightful for everyone to.
Could you take us one last question?
I can take it outside. Thank you very much.